Hey everybody, we're back. We're going to take a look at the main speedometer cluster. So, really didn't think this video was necessary, but the more I think about it, there are some things I think that are definitely worth pointing out. So, it's a pretty simple process as far as how to disassemble this. So let's kind of dive in real fast. So here's the main speedometer housing. I've got it flipped over. And what I want to go through is how to disassemble and put this back together. And on top of that, some things that are important related to the fuel and the temperature gauge. So in order to get this apart, obviously remove it from the vehicle first. And the first thing you need to do is remove the front of the gauge. And I've already kind of started this. So you'll see on 4 sides, the top and bottom and the 2 sides, you'll see that there's a place where the bezel is actually crimped into onto the main gauge itself. You'll need to basically kind of pry these back a little bit from the housing, and once you do that on all 4 sides, we should be able to remove this pretty easy. Let's see if I can set the phone down for just a second. So there we go. You can see that once you do that, it comes out fairly easy, and then we have the main gauge itself. Just FYI, remember before you put this all back together to go ahead and clean the glass. I've made that mistake of getting everything put back on and find out that the glass got kind of dirty during the disassembly process and had to take it back apart. So the next step in disassembling this is to remove these 2 screws right here on the back of the assembly. Once you take both of these out, and we're not going to do this because it's mind-numbingly easy, but anyhow, after you take these 2 screws out, you'll see that this center post actually will slide out. So I would recommend holding onto that as you take the 2 screws out, flip the thing over, and take the gauge out as a unit so you don't damage the needle or anything like that, and you can set it to the side. So there you have that portion of it. Once you take the main speedometer out, then you can actually remove the 2 gauges, the fuel gauge and the temperature gauge, just simply by removing the nuts. So again, it's pretty simple. The only reason I actually wanted to go through this is because there's something that I did not point out intentionally during the other videos, because I wanted to make this point here. I have here a fuel or temperature gauge, and I want to show you the back of it again. You'll notice that there's actually a plastic offset that prevents this from actually making contact with the main housing when it's installed, which means there's no ground to this guy. However, when you look at the back of the fuel gauge, you'll notice that there is a copper plate in the center of it, and that is intended to make ground with the housing once it's installed. So if that doesn't happen, that's where you have a potential to burn up your gauge. So what I like to do is actually take a couple of these tabs here, grab hold of them with a screwdriver or your fingernail, whatever it is, pry that out enough that you ensure that you're going to make a good ground. You see that these posts have got a little bit of an offset to them. So you want to make sure that this is actually raised up enough that it makes a good ground with the housing. And of course, once you have that done, and put it all back together, it would probably be wise of you to go ahead and just double check your ohms reading. This is the temperature gauge, which we should have roughly about 19 to 21 ohms. You can see that we've got that here. And again, you can I would definitely go through and check all your ohms again once it's installed back in the main housing. It should be 0 there, so we're pretty close to being 0. And just go through and check everything, including the points to ground for the fuel gauge. So that's a little bit lower than what we should see, and that's what we saw with the gauge before we installed it into the housing or the main cluster. That's again a little bit low, but these all still read roughly the same thing of what we had before. But double check that before you get too far and have the glass or the bezel crimp back in place and installed in the Jeep. It's again a step-by-step process. So once you're happy with everything, what I do to get this back together is get it positioned back in the bezel You don't want to grab a pair of pliers and squeeze this, because you'll damage the front of the bezel, which is actually visible from the interior of the Jeep. What I like to do is hold the cluster down and actually just push this back into place from the back side. I do that really good on all four sides, and you should have it all put back together. And you should be at the point where you can get it back in the Jeep. You can get it in the Jeep, use your little project board, your little demonstration board with the rheostat, and actually make sure the gauges move once it's installed before you go and hook it up to the wires that are the wiring harness and everything else. And if it works before you hook it up to the wiring harness and you know the gauges are great, and then if you hook it up to the wiring harness and it doesn't start registering, then you know you either have an issue with your sending units or the wiring in between the two, and then you can use your project board to go to each sending unit and basically start troubleshooting from there. Replace the fuel sending unit or the temperature sending unit with your project board, your rheostat, and actually make the gauges function, which would prove your wiring is good. You don't have a break in your wiring. And at that point, you're left questioning the sending unit, and if you've tested your fuel sending unit, you know it's not bad. The only thing left out there would be your temperature sending unit that you would possibly have to start questioning. So again, giving you the tools to do a little bit of troubleshooting step by step. So hopefully that helps out. And we'll take another look at a different video on some of the gauge calibrations if that's something you truly want to do. All right, thanks everybody.